Welcome to the James Allen on F1 podcast, brought to you by Autosport. The first triple header of the season is done. Some very tired people have headed back to Europe for a short Easter break before attacking the standalone Miami Grand Prix next week. And then there's another triple header, Imola, Monaco and Spain. 24-year-old Oscar Piastri leads the Drivers' World Championship for the first time in his career ahead of McLaren teammate Lando Norris after he won his third Grand Prix of the season. We'll get into why Max Verstappen is heaping praise on the Aussie. And with Lewis Hamilton describing Jeddah race as horrible, we will look in depth at what's going on at Ferrari. In the company of Motorsport Editor-in-Chief Ben Hunt. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm very good, thank you, James. All ready to go for Miami now.
Absolutely. And our F1 writer from Italy, Roberto Chinchero. Ciao, dottore.
Hi, James. Ciao. Ciao, Ben.
Ciao.
So let's start with your moment of the week. What really stood out for you from the weekend, Ben?
For me, I don't want to kick off on a negative here, but for me, it was the Lewis Hamilton reaction after Sunday's race. He did an interview with Sky F1, which lasted about 32 seconds, and there was no sugarcoating it. It was the moment that we had been fearing, and that is the reality of where he faces himself at the moment and the difficulty in turning it around. We've heard mixed messages from Hamilton over the months. He's been at Ferrari a couple of months. He's been at Ferrari, and it's all been fairly positive, but this was very doom and gloom. And while it was disappointing to hear, from a racing fan perspective, it was pure emotion. And I thought for me, that was the moment that really stood out.
How about you, Roberto?
I know now I'm surprising a little bit. My picture of the weekend is the back of the Red Bull of Yuki Tsunoda in qualifying. Why? There was a red flag. The timing was super tight after the red flag, but Red Bull decided to go for 2 runs. And it was the right decision, as well as the decision to ask Yuki to wait Max at the exit of corner 27. So in that particular moment, there was a lot of confusion because the red flag changed completely the plan of the team. And these people were so cold to plan and to ask Yuki to wait Max exactly in that moment. That was a crucial help because he gained an advantage of 1/10 on Piastri, and that was a key for pole position. That moment, my feeling was that Red Bull and Max squeezed everything possible from the car and from the scenario. And James, let me tell you, this remember me 1993, when McLaren and Senna, with obviously technical gap towards Williams, were able to use everything possible, writing fantastic pages in motorsport history. And that in that particular moment, I thought that, okay, Red Bull are really racer.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Very Senna-esque. It was Senna at the heart of all of that, wasn't it, with McLaren back in 1993? Well, we'll come on to talk about all this, particularly the Hamilton angle that you've raised there, Ben, a little bit later on. We're very lucky, obviously, to have Roberto, who knows everything of the ins and outs of Ferrari. We'll come on to that in a moment. I was in Jeddah. Very interesting weekend on many levels. First off, there was some very tired faces at the end of a triple header. It's only the beginning of the season, but this was Japan, Bahrain, and Saudi, following on, of course, from Australia and China before that. Ben, the logistical and physical challenge of doing 3 full Grand Prix weekends in 18 days is a byproduct of, obviously, of the calendar expansion to 24 races. But I think fans can imagine a lot of what life in F1 is like, the kind of drivers playing paddle, the private jets, the press engagements and stuff from watching Drive to Survive. But I don't think there's any way they can imagine what it takes to do a triple header. I know you've kind of buried yourself in with teams and gone on sort of truck rides and things and sort of really tried to get close to what that feels like. Have a go at explaining what a triple header feels like.
Well, it's logistically a giant jigsaw. You obviously have to prepare for the races and have all this equipment moving around the world, but you also have to now factor in the logistics of moving staff and keeping them on the right time zone, and the cost effectiveness of whether it's important to bring them back. If they're on the other side of the world, is it cost effective to bring them back for a few days with their families, or would they be better served staying on the right time zone? I think it's a very difficult thing to manage, that balance between sort of looking after your staff's sort of mental and physical capabilities while also balancing the cost aspect. And I think, we were talking about this internally in the office, and, Singapore last year was the last standalone race. We've had either back-to-backs or triple headers since then. And, it's a grueling schedule dealing with the time zones. I think for me as a journalist, it's tricky because, people think, from a fan perspective, it's great. We've got all this, for every week's Formula One race, it's like it doesn't stop. So you've got that side of it. The other side of it is that we have to keep coming up with stories. And if you imagine talking to, your boss every day, 4 times a week, 3 weeks in a row, it becomes almost laborious in the sense of you run out of things to say. And, you get a feeling that the press run out of steam, and then the drivers also sort of run out of enthusiasm as well. And they get a little bit fed up with it. And I think you saw a little bit of tetchiness. I know Max Verstappen was hit with that 5-second penalty, and he reacted in a way that, some people say it's petulant. He wasn't answering the questions in the media. He was obviously minding what he was, saying, because he obviously got penalised, ironically, in that Singapore race for swearing. But it kind of, everything slows down. Your ability to work to the best of your ability, it's inhibited by just being tired. And I think, we see that within staff enthusiasm, and obviously the driver's mentality as well. And, it's a little bit of a shame that we have these triple headers and just so many of them.
Yeah. Roberto, from a racing point of view, I find it really interesting that, Ben talks there about how kind of, as you say, if you're a TV company and you're just interviewing Max, 3 or 4 times a weekend, 3 weekends in a row, he's like sick of the sight of you by the end of the triple header. But from a racing point of view, it's really interesting that you can have such different outcomes, across 3 races in 18 days. Take Verstappen, for example, pole and a win in Japan, then 7th on the grid and 6th at the flag in Bahrain. It's the end of the world. They're having crisis meetings. And then pole, amazing teamwork with Tsunoda, like you say, and almost a win, apart from the controversial first corner that we'll talk about in a minute, a week after that. And this kind of confusing picture is really playing out up and down the grid, apart from McLaren.
I like this confusion. I like when it's difficult to predict the result of the race. But I think the team have reached the limit of the development of this generation cars. And the technical solutions are so extreme that the variable related to the track layout, the temperature, the tire compounds are crucial elements for performance. You are right when you say that there are different outcomes every week, but McLaren is the only exception to this rule. They have a clear technical advantage. But we saw in Jeddah how much performance they lose from FP3 to qualifying due to the 15-degree drop of the track temperature. So my opinion is that everyone is subject to up and down of their performance. Everything depending on the condition, but McLaren can count on the car with more downforce, better balanced, and this all of them to always be in front. Sometimes with a big gap, like in FP3 in Jeddah, sometimes with a small one, but in any case they are in front. But again, I really hope that in the next races, in the second part of the season will be very unpredictable. The context, that's what I like.
Absolutely. So Piastri wins again, Mr. Consistent, as he's become. And, he's giving himself a great chance every time, starting on the front row now 4 times in 5 races. None of his rivals have managed more than twice. I'm interested, Roberto, what are they saying in Italy about Piastri? He is half Italian. His dad's family, as I understand it, comes from a small community near Pisa on the west coast of Tuscany, one of the most beautiful parts of Italy. Heaven only knows why they left there to go to Australia. It's like people go rushing to Tuscany in the summer. But anyway, what I want to know is whether the Italians are now claiming him as one of their own. If he wins the World Championship, are they going to say, yeah, Forza Italia?
Well, he spent 2 seasons in Italy when he was in Prema, in F2, F3, but he did not trying to improve his Italian, and honestly, he did not show particularly interest about his Italian roots. It's not like Felipe Massa or Daniel Ricciardo that often talk, especially with the Italian media, about the story of their family. Oscar is more is completely focused on racing. He doesn't like to speak about other topics, but there is still great interest about Oscar because Andrea Stella never miss a chance to talk about Oscar, to talk about the great grown confirmed at the start of this season. I would like to add that Oscar is not a person that show particular his emotion. No, you can see him after a success, after the race, or listening his team radio during the race. He looks very, very cold. So from that point of view, James, is not very late in Oscar. I think he's more Australian guy.
Ben, you've got a fantastic piece out on Autosport at the moment about Mark Webber's influence on Piastri as a manager. He's been looking after him along with his wife Anne for a few years now, and there's that sort of steeliness that Webber learned from the tough life that he had as a Formula One driver. Some of the being on the wrong side of things quite a lot, within Red Bull, and having to put up with all of those things. Never achieved that F1 World Championship himself. But your piece is great because it really focuses on how Verstappen has picked up on Piastri's caliber. Now, there's probably a little bit of mucking around here with Lando's head by talking up Piastri and his qualities. I wouldn't put that past Max, but maybe explain a little bit about how you see this dynamic of Max kind of boosting Piastri.
Yeah, I think that he does see some similarities in himself with Oscar Max, that is. And it was interesting that the quote did dwell on the sort of father figure, and I think you need to sort of look a little bit at the Piastri upbringing, and I think it's really interesting there that you were talking about how he doesn't see himself as Italian, he sees himself as Australian, but I actually see him more of a sort of a very fluid character. He doesn't really sort of have roots. I think that we look back into his upbringing, and yes, he was an Australian and grew up in Australia. He moved to the UK with his father, Chris, to further his racing career. But I did a bit of research for a book I've got coming out, and it was looking into sort of McLaren and Oscar and the relationship. And, there was a situation where him and his dad are living in a flat in north of London, and they sort of had this moment of, Chris, his father, turns around to him and says, look, I've got to go back to Australia. I've got to run the business, look after the family. You either come with me or you can stay here and we'll put you in boarding school and you can further your racing career. And for Oscar, it was a no-brainer. He was going to stay. They enlisted the help of a guy called Rob McIntyre, who sort of managed the career. He was a sort of a scout and was almost like that father figure for Oscar while his dad was at home. So, there was that separation moment. And under this guidance, he was able to progress through his career. But then it got to a point where they needed that leg up to get from, I think it was F3 or just becoming into F3 and then into Formula One. They needed a career path, someone that could manage it. And that's when they turned to Mark for help and Anne. And of course, they've now taken over, and now Mark is able to pass on all the information that he's learned to Oscar and to turn him into a more sort of fierce competitor, a more rounded individual. So it's really interesting that you've got these points in Oscar's life. You've got his dad doing the initial, the upbringing and introducing him to karting and taking him so far. Then you've got another character within the UK doing the same thing, and now you've got Mark taking him on even further. So he's kind of a mix of all those father figures, which have allowed him to become this ultimate racer, if you like. The no emotion. He's got the skill, he's got the talent, but he now knows what he needs to do to win championships, and that's an awesome combination. And the reason Max has picked up on it is because he's experienced similar things with his own dad, and the way that his dad pushed him so hard. It's a different upbringing, but it's nonetheless effective.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Without getting too sort of psychological.
Yes.
But it is interesting because I think, you look at these dads, these racing dads, and it's the same with football dads and tennis dads, mums.
Yeah.
you're kind of living vicariously through the kids. And, there's also this thing of achieving something you didn't achieve yourself. So Jos Verstappen was a very talented racing driver, but he never made the most of himself. Okay, he was up against Schumacher as a teammate of Benetton, which, was difficult enough for everybody, but he never really made the most of himself. And it's a little bit like that with Webber, I think. He is, you say he's a bit like a father figure to Oscar. And he's, he never got that championship. And I think his satisfaction, if he can steer Oscar to a world title, whether it's this year or in the future or multiple years, I really feel that quite strongly. There's this, it's very, very interesting dynamic going on there. I'm sure we'll return to this in future podcasts because it's never-ending fascination to me. We talked last week, though, about, talking about the mental side of the sport, about, his teammate Lando Norris and some of the worrying admissions that he was making about his kind of vulnerabilities. Now, rule number one in Jeddah, as we all know, high-speed street circuit, is keep it out of the barriers at all costs. But he went and crashed in quali. We don't pretend to know what's going on inside his head. We can't say for sure whether the pressure or what it was, but that is a mistake that you don't want to be making in a championship fight. What do you make of his mindset right now, guys?
Yeah, I think he's in a very strange position because towards the end of last year, when I spoke to him, he said that he learned a lot last year being in a championship battle with Verstappen. He knew, his words were something like, I know what I need to do to win the title, and it's to have the mentality. He also confessed to being perhaps too honest in the media with his feelings and showing emotion. And I thought, right, okay, so he has learned those lessons. But very quickly, over these 5 races, we've seen it swing from the confidence in Australia in that victory to a very dejected. He's beating himself up at coming away from Jeddah. He admitted that it was his mistake. He needs to be kinder to himself, and also that he needs to, cut out these errors because he's making it life hard for himself. And he seems to have gone back on his word where he said, I need to not to be so open. I need to learn my lessons. And he's gone back to this default setting, which presents a character who is fallible and is struggling. Whether he is or isn't, we don't know. And you're right to say that, James, that we shouldn't really just assume. But how it's projected to the outside world is that he looks vulnerable. And I think that we know, working in Formula One, if you show any form of vulnerability, which Oscar doesn't do and Max doesn't do, for instance, then your rivals will seize on that. And I think that's the difficult scenario that he faces right now, is trying to stop people accusing him of being weak.
Well, let's get into Verstappen's penalty then, because it was obviously the big talking point of the weekend. He deliberately moved out to the right to take a different angle into turn one, having lost that initial getaway to Piastri. He was on pole, lost the getaway. Piastri pulls alongside him. He tries a different attack angle into turn one and runs wide as a consequence because Piastri's on the apex. And he was judged by the stewards to have gained an advantage and had a 5-second penalty that he had to serve. He chose, and the team chose, not to give the place back and try and fight, obviously because overtaking was going to be difficult. But he did say afterwards that maybe he would have had a chance if he'd had to give the place back, as far as I understand it. But in the end, they chose to serve the penalty at the pit stop that obviously ultimately handed that win to Piastri. Red Bull found it harsh. Where do you two stand on this? Roberto, start with you.
I suppose Max, after the race, was a bit nervous because Oscar did exactly what he did for a long time, and he did very well with Oscar. We have seen in the first 4 races that the track position at the exit to the first corner is crucial element to win. There's no doubt about that. So I'm not surprised that by what we have seen in Jeddah, everybody wants to be in front at the first corner. It's crucial this season. Oscar and Max knew that big part of the game was to be leader at that point. So what changed? The expected scenario was that Oscar did an excellent start. I think that surprised a lot of Max. And Oscar managed to get the apex point in front of Max, and that gave him the right to having room. So that is what the rules say today. Then we can discuss if it's fair or not, but if you apply the regulation in force today, the decision is correct. And I receive 100 message, James, from people also from the paddock that want to discuss about the penalty of 5 seconds. But that are the rules at the moment. They changed the rules last year after all the polemic stories between Lando and Max in Austin and in Mexico. And that are the rules. Then we can discuss the rules if are fair or not. But at the moment, the decision that the stewards had was correct.
I agree. This is the precedent that was set. I think it's actually good that they are sticking to the rules and they aren't changing for once. We can't sit there and say the FIA got this wrong. They've got it right based on their previous, and the penalty was according to what they've done before. So I didn't really have a problem with it. I thought it was really interesting that Christian Horner came out in the media afterwards and brought pictures and evidence. But of course, it is telling that they didn't protest the results. So, that's probably all you need to know about that.
So, as Roberto hinted at there, it's so important this year. We've already seen that now. Suzuka was another example. So, you know how F1 is. This is going to become one of those acute situations where literally, when one penalty like that can cost the race win, and 7 extra points, let's not forget, that you get from finishing first rather than second. The way F1 works, you just know that there's going to be more of these this season, and it's going to become, there was one season when it was like everything was all about track limits, and it all became very obsessive. And then the 21 season had all these things, and then the Norris and Verstappen. So this is going to become a thing. It's just going to become a thing, and it's going to get quite nasty at times about whether there's consistency in the decision making and the penalties and stuff. It's just got that feeling about it, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think so, and that's convergence of the cars with the regulations being stable. Everyone's quick. There's not much that separates now. When you look at qualifying, look how close they are. It's brilliant for us to watch. And yeah, it will put pressure in other areas, which will generate good stories, and more the merrier.
Well, Roberto, come on. We've got you here, and we want to talk about Ferrari. Everybody wants to know. Leclerc on the podium in Jeddah for the first time this season. Hamilton, as Ben mentioned earlier on, a very disappointed 6th. Let's start with the positives, Roberto. Leclerc was competitive. There were, however, some suggestions that he's having to do some quite extreme things on the car setup to get the car to perform. What can you tell us?
But when Charles arrived at the media pen after the race, I think the expression of his face said a lot. A lot. You can see that he is happy. He's very happy with how he's driving, and I think he's also happy with the setup choices that he's making in this first part of the season. But at the same time, perfect job, because he did a perfect job. Today does not allow him to go beyond third place. That is the maximum he can achieve, and this is the negative part of the story. I'm noticing the last races that every time Leclerc enters the pits, he asks for more front wing every time. And I think he's pushing at the limit the setup on the front, and this with his driving very, very well, with his driving style. He loves the car with a very strong front, and from that point of view, this Ferrari car this season come to his aid. But in terms of overall performance, something is missing. So it's a mixed feeling for Charles. I think he's driving very, very well in this part of the season, but he's frustrated because driving well is not possible to achieve more than P3 at the moment.
Roberto, tell us a little bit about the pressure that's building inside Ferrari at this point.
Of course, we all expect, James, a different start to Hamilton's story in Ferrari. There is disappointment. I think Lewis' face throughout the Jeddah weekend was quite explanatory. He's very disappointed. Fred Vasseur is protecting his driver. I think it's right that he does it, but the question that many people are asking is what happened in the coming races? That is the point. I mentioned before that Leclerc asked more front wing every time comes in the pits. Well, Lewis is asking less. That means that the feeling that Lewis is having with this car, especially in braking and in the corner access, is not the one he needs to have. It's not the one he needs to be fast. And I think he tried with his engineer all the possible option that the setup can offer, but it's not enough. He needs something different in the car. And the question now is if Ferrari can afford the development the car considering this problem. Every update normally has the target to improve the performance. It's not easy to ask the team to consider the drivability, especially when you see that the other driver is performing much faster. So at the moment, it's not easy to see a solution. And I agree with Lewis. It's not easy to see the future in the moment. I really hope that he can change a little bit his drive style, but probably after 12 years in Mercedes, for him it's very difficult to change some instinct, basic instinct in driving style. And it's question of tense, but this Formula One is all question of tense. You see, sometimes we talk about, Ben knows, we talk about 7,000s. You see, one guy is slower because he 1,000 slower than another one. It's incredible, but that is the Formula One we are watching now. And for Lewis to be some tenths behind Leclerc is a big problem.
Well, he described the weekend as horrible. And as you alluded to there, we said that with no fix on the horizon, he's sort of got a sinking feeling that this might be how it's going to be for the rest of the season. I was interested as well, talking about sort of human behavior and reactions and things. Fred Vasseur got angry with questions in the press briefing after the race about Hamilton's performance. Obviously, that normally is a tell of feeling that kind of pressure, feeling a little bit out of control in a situation. Ben, you know Lewis well. How do you see this from Hamilton? How are you reading this from Hamilton's point of view?
Yeah, it's a touchy situation. I think that Ferrari are obviously trying to control the situation, and I think that we need to remember how Carlos Sainz was as a character, and very much, yeah, sure, he was emotional, but he would always be able to hold stuff in. I think Lewis is very passionate. There was so much expectation. Him winning the sprint race in China gave us all a false sense of, wow, Lewis is back, Ferrari are back, everything's good. But then when things go wrong, Lewis finds it very hard to keep it in. And I think that he does speak out, and Ferrari realise that they can't control that. That's just raw emotion, and I think that's the difficulty. There's no control over his passion, which is great from a journalistic point of view, and it's all part of his character. But of course, him speaking out in the media and saying, I thought we was making progress. What do you need to get on top of this car? A brain transplant, like really big headlines. But of course, there's no control over that, and it sends the wrong message that everyone else is trying to, trying to deliver. And it is difficult if you've got one driver that's performing well in the car, and the other driver's not. But that is the management game. That is what Fred Vasseur's got to do. He's got to look after both those drivers. And yes, it's right to protect. You can't control what Lewis says. You can't control what Charles says, but it's working together and trying to stay on top of that. It is hard now, though, because they've obviously got to develop in two different ways, and I don't know what the answer is. I sense this, Lewis's frustration. Totally understand it. I just don't know how they fix it. That's the problem.
And of course, the sort of narrative demons are floating around here in the background. He turned 40 in January, and he came off the back of a 2024 season where he was outperformed by George Russell. So the people, the sort of the naysayers, will say, "Oh well, he's kind of past his prime now. He's not the force that he once was." And I don't believe that. I still think he's quite capable of getting the job done. But the problem is, the facts of the case in front of people. They can judge things with their own eyes. If you're tenths, as Roberto said, if you're tenths off Leclerc, what conclusions can we draw? You can explain it away all you like with the way the car is set up and very fine margins of the last, knockings of this sort of design cycle. But it's a real catch-22 now for Ferrari. Do they put some resource into trying to sort the problems out for Lewis so it's not a kind of utterly miserable campaign for him? I go back Roberto, to a conversation I had with Fred Vasseur in May of last year. Obviously Lewis had been announced, and I went over to Maranello to talk to him. And he said, he was talking about Lewis, and he said, he asked himself, where does he have the best chance to win in 25, 26, 27? In other words, suggesting that that's kind of the time horizon that he and Ferrari have given themselves. So I think, do they need to keep that central in mind, that is the project, the 25, 26, 27 horizon?
25 is gone, I think, in terms of driver championship. It's tough to say, but it is what it is. Was not that the plan? Because if you remember, Ferrari was the team that scored more points than any others in the last 6 races last year. They finished seconds in the constructor championship with only the gap was only 14 points from McLaren. So when you finish a season in that way, you can only have one target next season. You can try to win the championship. And now they are celebrating the first podium at race 5. And it's not absolutely not the target that Ferrari had at the start of the season. As you mentioned, for Lewis, his staff, I can understand this point of view, but I spent hours talking with engineers in the paddock, asking what is difficult now when you change a team. Which problem you have? Because in the past, I remember Kimi Raikkonen jumped from McLaren to Ferrari to win race 1. Same happened with Alonso when he jumped from Renault to Ferrari. Well, he won the race 1. And so now it's completely different. Depends from how the engine mode works, the feeling you have. A lot of parameters, a lot of feeling. And we talk, as we mentioned before. We sometimes we talk about 1/10, 2/10. So Formula One is changed. It looks like to change a team is a big challenge for everybody, especially if you spend a lot of time in your old team. You spent 12 years in Mercedes.
It's interesting, isn't it? You mentioned how close it was at the end of last season. We all looked at that. Normally, a season ending strongly is a great indicator for the season to follow, particularly if you haven't got a rule change. What were they, 14 points behind, you said, at the end of 2024 in the
Yes,
Constructors? After 5 rounds, they're already 110 points behind McLaren. And we are,
that's the picture. That is the picture.
If you kind of scale that up then across a 24 race season, if nothing changes, they'll finish 480 points behind McLaren in the constructors from 14 to 480. Clearly things will change. It won't always, I'm sure it won't carry on completely like this, but that is the scale of the situation we're talking about. Quick word before we go, guys, about Williams. Not talked about them too much this season on the pod, but clearly 2 strong drivers. We all know that. And they've had their best start quietly to an F1 season since 2016. Double points finish in Jeddah. So credit to them for that. They were talking down their chances for 25, saying they weren't going to do anything on the car and expected a tough season. But I guess James Vowles and his crew there have got a really positive feeling going within the team. 2 drivers pushing each other. And what interests me is that after a slow start, Carlos Sainz has now out-qualified Alex Albon 2 races in a row, which hasn't happened to Albon since the start of 2023. You both know both these drivers well, as do I. How are you reading this little dynamic?
For me, it was interesting because I thought all that talk about Sainz going in at Williams, everyone was saying, oh, wow, it's going to be great to see him there, which it is. But I thought the other aspect was that Albon stepped up and delivered, and he scored 20 of the 25 points so far, which has been hugely impressive. He's not rolled over under the pressure of the new man coming in, and I thought that was really good. It's really interesting now, though, to see the change of public perception and the swell of support now for Sainz, and I think that's why Miami is going to be crucial to assess that team dynamic, because if you're in a scenario now where Sainz starts regularly outscoring Albon, then that can cause tensions within the team, and I think it's going to be an interesting picture to watch how that develops.
Roberto?
But about Carlos, it's more or less the same story that we explained about Lewis. When you change a team, it's not easy. In this case, I remember that in Suzuka they changed the chassis of the car because they have no answer to some question. It was difficult to answer for the engineer. But I think sometimes it's crazy. Formula One, as you mentioned, James, they are not introducing any update in the car, and that's probably is a good point. They have no chance to make any mistake. And they knows the car better and better because at the moment they need to finish races. They finish to be ready to get a chance every time one of the top team has a problem, and that is the target of the season. In my opinion, Albon is a very underrated guy in the paddock, and that is another point when we talk with some fans, some people. Of course, the spotlight are in the first 2, 3, 4 rows, but the level of the driver in this Formula One probably is one of the highest level, and you can see when a top driver like Sainz has some problem with the feeling of the car, Albon is faster. And it's a good news for Williams. I think that, but it's not a surprise. I think this is the start of the new project. It's good to see a good and glorious name like Williams coming up, but I'm sure that they are going to 26 to do another step up.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much to you both for joining us. And remember, you can read Ben and Roberto on Motorsport and Autosport. Remember to send in your comments and questions to @JamesAllen on F1 on X. And do check out our new Race Center Live watch-along on Motorsport for the upcoming Miami Grand Prix, where Matt and Tommy from P1 will be joining the feed. And do also join our fast-growing Fantasy League community. Check out themotorsport.com for details, or the episode description notes will have the link there as well.